The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. My name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. I want to start these proceedings by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to all First Nations people here today and to all elders past and present. So today, it's my pleasure to be introducing Emerita Professor Webb. So Jen is a Professor Emerita of Creative Practice here in the Faculty of Arts and Design. Her most recent poetry collections are the sole-authored book, The Daily News, from 2024, which was shortlisted for the 2025 ACT Literary Awards, and the multiply authored book, Grief, 5 Sequences. Jen is also an editor of various genres of writing, having published 11 scholarly collections and 11 creative collections. She's co-editor of the scholarly journal Axon, Creative Explorations, and also of the literary journal Meniscus. And Jen was, of course, the inaugural director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. She's a much cherished colleague who, along with Tracy, who is also here today, has given me a huge help over the last few years in, working through this position of being the director of the CCCR. So please join me in welcoming Jen.
Hello, comrades. Yeah. I acknowledge, of course, that we're standing here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and my respects to the elders past and present, and to the community past and present. Nothing digital today, not even a slideshow. I'm going to be total analog, just talk to you a bit about talking about words. This presentation is actually part of a project I'm engaged in with my colleagues, Catherine Coles from University of Utah and Julia Prendergast from Swinburne Uni. We've been playing around with the questions of genre from early 2000s, certainly early 2020s rather. We first started presenting in conferences in about 2022, 23, and we've been going steadily since then. So it's not a very new project, but for all of us, it's a product of years of being creative writers, people who are embedded in university systems, people who are teaching students, connected to our colleagues in creative writing, of course, but also in other disciplines like cultural theory, literary studies, sociology. The stimulus for each of us was a bit different. For me, it's just native curiosity. For Kate, the stimulus was the idea of the lyric essay. I asked her to write an academic essay for Axon a few years ago, and she said, well, she can't. Could she send me something weird instead? And I said, sure. And that was the start of her career. Now she's quite famous now as being someone who writes and publishes lyric essays. But what does it mean to write a lyric essay? What are the rules? What are the expectations? What are the conventions? It doesn't fit. It's neither one thing nor the other. So how does it work? That's what she was interested in. Julia's stimulus was a bit different. She produced a book of short stories, and there was rather a mean-spirited review of it, which went moan, bitch. They're not even really stories. They're really more like poetry. They operate like poetry. So she was quite hurt, but I was interested in the word operating. And then I wrote a positive review of the book for somewhere else, by the way. I'm interested in operation because that allows us to understand how we do things, with what techniques, to what effects. Also, I taught genre as all creative writing teachers do. This is a short story, this is a novel, this is poetry, blah, blah, blah. So you think about those frameworks. And I taught a subject called genre for 3 or 4 years here, which brought our writers, TV media producers, and our digital media producers together. And all this forced me to think about the principles we apply and how and why, and whether such a taxonomical project as genre can have any relevance in the world of ideas and words and creative activity. Of course it does, on the one hand. People have been writing about this at least since Aristotle, probably earlier, but I've gone back as far as Aristotle. People have been exploring the concept and writing about the framing principles for clustering texts into types or genres. Kate and Julia and I have been investigating a lot of this work, reading up on it, catching up on what is already known. Thanks, Paul. And now we're working our way through the lesser understood or recognized long grass of that field to try and make sense of the ways the term might mean and be and do, and how using genre might provide frameworks or pointers for operations outside text and in the world. The product of all this research and writing about the topic is that over 2,000 years or so, there's been an inevitable accretion of definitions and conventions and expectations and articulations and axioms and arguments and probably interpretive dance about genre. That makes it all seem like a very messy, confusing, and contradictory space. It can be boiled down to something very simple. We probably can all say this in our sleep. A genre is a group of texts and or practices and or organizing structures that cluster like with like. Objects in a specific genre are characterized by instances of repetition and difference. And those are really famous kind of definitions for what genre is. Genre works too because it has a kind of an organic truth principle, because the focus that genre has on clustering things together at least gestures towards science, where we have the organized categories of species, genus, family, class, order, phylum, kingdom, and domain found in biology. Jacques Derrida, he discusses the concept of genre in both the textual and the non-textual. He talks about the scientific taxonomy of natural typologies. He talks about the taxonomy of typologies that are not natural. And he says in brackets, for example, an artistic, poetic, or literary genre. He writes about the ways in which biological taxonomy has inflected our attitudes towards textual taxonomy. So we treat it as though it's a real thing, just like biological groupings are. He says, as soon as the word genre is sounded, as soon as it is heard, as soon as one attempts to conceive it, a limit is drawn. The limit, of course, is on what an object is allowed to do and be and where it's allowed to belong. And he continues with this law of genre. One must respect a norm. One must not cross the line of demarcation. One must not risk impurity, anomaly, or monstrosity. Lyric essays are, of course, impurities, anomalies, and monstrosities, prose poetry similarly. He goes on to debunk this logic because it really doesn't work when it comes to human practice. He argues persuasively, too, that a text does not belong to any genre. Every text participates in one or more genres. There is no genreless text because we always think in terms of what's going on there, what's it like. But their participation in genre never amounts to belonging. Look, I'm a constant migrant, and I kind of get that as a human. I participate and have participated as a permanent resident or citizen for a number of nations, but that means you never fully belong to any of them, or you belong to all of them. So it's a really murky, once you get humans into this taxonomy structure, it gets really murky. And Derrida's position is quite close to that of Wittgenstein. He famously uses the idea of family resemblances to construct his logic of a genre as a something that is shared. And he does so most famously in his discussion of games. Let me read you his discussion, because he's a beautiful writer. Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean, board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Do not say there must, emphasis in original, there must be something common or they would not be called games. But look and see whether there is anything common to them, because if you look at them, you won't see something that's common to all. You will see similarities, relationships. Out of this comes the axiom that genre for Wittgenstein is a matter of family resemblances. He does say in that same essay that games form a family, that's a quote, but it's not a family of individuals who share a common ancestry, not the way we think of human families. And he says that's because it's too confining. Rather, it's a family of individuals who collectively comprise, here's his complicated sentence, a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes merely similarities of detail. Because, of course, language uses, language games, in short, genres can't participate convincingly in the scientific constructs of taxonomy. Rather, what they do is create effects of reality and truth, effects of authority and plausibility, effects that mean that text and other instances of genre, in John Froe's words, do not belong to genres, but are uses of them. So they're out there. We pick and choose a bit when we're doing our work and when we're understanding what we're looking at in other places. Most of us are pretty confident we can actually apply genres, convincingly to text. We can cluster text into genres like sci-fi, detective fiction, life writing, travel writing, interactive narratives, philosophy, poetry, the news. More recently, there has been a quiet and to some extent overlooked revolt against the law of genre. And there's a growing corpus of scholarship that asserts we are now in a post-genre age. I know that in a world at war and looking at environmental crisis, this is hardly world-shattering, but it does have an impact on practices for those of us who are creatives, on the reception of practices, and on how, as humans, we might reflect on the way we perceive and engage with the world. And it's worth attention because genre is more pervasive, more problematic, and more problematized than they might have thought of back in the 1980s or 90s, in the heyday of people like Gunter Kress or Peter Knapp or Carolyn Miller or Steve Neill. It's difficult, doesn't really work, but it hasn't gone away. An anonymized reviewer for the journal Science Fiction Studies wrote this: after years of scholarly struggle to define the field of science fiction, most of us have recognized the frustrations of capturing definitively a body of literature that, though we treat it as genre writing in curricula and in the marketplace, always defies genre boundaries. So we see the world through these frameworks, especially in terms of our curricula, especially in terms of our marketing of particular kinds of product. But just as the world is inconveniently messy and confusing and full of the unexpected, so too are texts. Hard word to say. It doesn't take much of a shift for a text to overlap genres, to crisscross, to move outside what you thought were its boundaries. Even a little shock will do. I'm going to tell you a story about Little Shock that made me think about this a couple of years ago. I experienced the crisscrossing of memoir and the genre of autobiography and the genre of health institutions, because genres don't just organize language and text, they also organize social spaces and practices. And the story I tell about it also crisscrosses the personal and the scholarly, the empirical and the felt. So in April 2024, I woke to the news from New Zealand that a beloved family member had just suffered a catastrophic accident, had been transported by air to another town on another island to enter another reality, the reality of the spinal unit at the hospital in Christchurch. His partner, another beloved family member, had traveled with him to this other town. In her state of stress, in the rush to get out of there, in her anxiety, her behavior changed, or to be more honest, her behavior became more explicit. What she started doing in the hospital showed that she was crisscrossing the genres of adult performance to become something that wasn't actually fully adult, to the extent that the hospital diagnosed her with early stage dementia and moved her out of the hospital accommodation near the spinal unit, where she could spend her days with her partner, to a residential care unit kilometers away where she couldn't. This wasn't an easy move, so the dementia care unit emailed me, asked me to come and be a good family member and settle her in there. So flew across there to that town on that island, and I spent my days during May and into June walking from my 1970s style motel, which is a genre of motel we can all recognize, to the dementia unit, which is a genre of health institution. I Ubered with her in the morning, and Uber is a genre of public transport, from the dementia care unit to the hospital, another genre, to visit her broken love. We'd stay there for a while, Uber back in time for her lunch because the dementia care unit required her to take meals there unless it was prearranged. Then I'd try and persuade her to come shopping with me so I could buy her apples and the clothes and toiletries and books and art material she needed. She wouldn't come. And then we'd Uber back to the hospital for an afternoon visit when we'd move around behind the partner's wheelchair, or we'd carry trays of barely adequate coffee from the kiosk back down to the other spinal unit patients, trapped in their bodies and in their beds. Late afternoon, back in an Uber, traveling back to the dementia unit, through the back blocks of Christchurch, along the Avon River. We go inside and sit together in the shared spaces where all the other residents live their wondering and wandering lives, where they tell their strange stories, and where Alice, the diversionary therapist, tries to divert them. Okay? This is kind of Wittgensteinian, this particular bit. One afternoon I was there, she was tossing a beach ball and seeing if they would catch it and throw it back. Some of the folk did remember the genre of game. They caught the ball, tossed it back, clapped their hands, they'd laugh. Some didn't remember. Some just went blank as it went by. Some were agitated. Sally, for instance, paced the room afizz with emotion, saying, I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go. And Alice came and took her hand to try and lead her into distraction. But Sally wasn't having it. She pushed her, poor little Alice staggered, the other staff had to pour in. The game goes on. While all this is happening over here, other games are happening. At a table near the wall, Barry was playing cards with Joan. He dealt them 7 cards each, tells her to start. But I don't know the rules, she says. He doesn't know them either. Just pretend, says the nurse, and they play. I've made up all the names, by the way. These aren't the real names. Others are playing a version of tiddlywinks, pushing yellow ping-pong balls with uncertain fingers while gesturing to people who aren't actually there. The far end of the living room, though, Malcolm is reinterpreting the game of tiddlywinks by throwing the yellow balls at the wall. Not like that, Malcolm, says Alice, patting his arm, and he's switched off, going from fully grown child to dull effigy. Through all this, the staff are moving among the residents like kind spirits, bringing cups of tea and biscuits, bringing hugs, bringing consolation in a confusing world where all the roadmaps of meaning, all the generic formations under which they understand the world have blurred. And so it goes on until sleep starts to overtake the dementia unit, and I tuck my relative Don and leave to walk the 4 kilometers through dark, unfamiliar streets to my motel. There's a story of genre. It's Wittgensteinian because it's games the residents are playing, though they have nothing in common with games as such. If there are rules, no one knows what they are. They aren't games played for competition or companionship or even just for fun. No one is strategizing, and crucially, no one is intensely and utterly absorbed, to use Huizinga's definition of the game. What these games do, though, is comprise the network of similarity with games we more easily recognize. They track alongside and occasionally crisscross that genre, are going somewhere entirely else. Spending my days yo-yoing between these 2 health institutions led me to think more broadly about the operations of genre, beyond text, beyond personae. Okay? Because the 2 operate according to very different expectations, different conventions, and different rules. And it's reasonable to call them genres. No less a scholar than Vygotsky explored what he called the integration of genre analysis with activity system theory way back in 1978, and he drew an analogy between science and tools as providing the external systems by which humans can effectively operate. So the operations are different in these units. In the hospitals, anyone can come and go at will. I mean, the people in the spinal unit couldn't because they couldn't move, but if they could discharge themselves if they wanted. No locks on the doors, no fogs in the brain. At the dementia care unit, anyone can enter, but only those in possession of the codes can leave. I have the codes, that is the code for the door lock. When I leave, the old people watch me punch in the numbers. Doesn't matter if they can see the numbers I press because they can no longer make sense of the operation. And I kept listening, visiting and listening to the stories at each institution. At the spinal unit, the patient's stories very comfortably fit in the genre of conversation. They talk about surgery and rehab and prognoses, talk about catastrophe, talk about the horse race they saw on television this afternoon, their daughter, the farm they hope to return to. Their stories cohere generically. But these elderly people at the Rivilethe only give fragments, and I can only tell fragments. They are talking a lot, mostly to him or herself, sometimes to their ghosts, sometimes just to the wall. A few have retained a little literacy with respect to the game of narrative, of conversation. Margaret is not her name, the name I'm using. Margaret especially was always present in the shared spaces, talking to other residents, talked a lot to me, offering a lot of advice. She likes to be in charge, she tells me, behind her hand, confidentially, because, I quote from her, I was an only child, of course, so I always expected things to go my way. Pretty children usually get their way. And then she paused, looked in the mirror, and said, not that I was a pretty child, but good enough, they said. Then she took my hand, awkwardly, and put on her strangely misshapen hip. Feel that, she said. My mother fell and broke both her hips, and then I did too. I was 7, she was 70. So I got up and I walked all the way to the hospital carrying Mum. They were amazed, those doctors at the hospital, but they didn't do a good job of my hips. And these stories continue. They melange of tales that might or might not be true, where the logic of time is discarded, but human affect are retained. She reached into what remained of her memory, weaving a magic carpet on which she could fly back to a life where she had capacity and autonomy, weaving what performs in a language game way as an autobiography. But it's an autobiography that might overlap with or crisscross with, but never belong to that real genre. Her constructions of her persona flutter and flicker from hour to hour because there is nowhere any longer for her to file her memories. There are individual jottings and early drafts still in her brain. They can be taken out and tried out, even though they don't work. One of my last evenings there, I'm sitting at the dining room table with the residents while the staff help them to find cutlery and napkins and help them to convey bits of chicken hot pot to their mouths. "I want wine," says an old man. "You and me both," says the nurse. Black cat paces between the residents, expecting, mostly receiving attention. Sandra reaches across and taps me on the arm. "What are you in for?" Henry across the table grumbles, "I'm the only one who doesn't belong here. I was brought here by the police, but I didn't do it. I never would. But my wife won't sign the papers, so here I'm stuck with all these gaga nutters." Everyone just ignored him. I phone home each night to tell John the stories I've been listening to during the day. "It sounds like Beckett," he says. "All those sentences that should have meaning, but don't. All that realism, that's only only crisscrossing with realism." Okay? It is, and I'll finish with this, an example of what's increasingly being explored as part of the post-genre logic, which has been emerging. You see it a lot in political discourse writing and in the research into music. Scholars who work on this, especially looking at the speech of politicians, can identify the tensions that arise between the genre of political speech, what you expect to see from a politician, and how violations of those conventions point to the extent to which political discourse is driven by ideology rather than evidence or logical best practice. Like, we knew this intuitively at least, but post-genre analyses allow us to formally identify and measure how they've broken out from the law of genre to do something very different. Our attention goes on alert when Trump speaks and he breaks that parent wall of genre. In applying this logic of post-genre to discourses from the field of power makes it clear that political discourse is predicated on ideological persuasion, posturing, and duplicity, something we're always supposed to pretend isn't happening. A second line of thought in post-genre scholarship, which I think is useful, is based on the argument that conventional genres are deeply immersed in a specifically Western way of seeing and dividing up the world. And I do think that's interesting as well. If we can observe the slippages across, between, and within genres, this can help to highlight the limitations of Western perceptions and narratives, can point to the violence through which these actually manifest as ideology and not as actuality, and help us to look outside those well-established 2,000 years of it's the Western way or highway, and see other kinds of ways of organizing the world and everything in it. The writers I think I find most interesting or persuasive in the whole post-genre are those who recognize that you can't just dismiss the idea of genre, which I mentioned earlier. What we can do, though, is treat it more analytically, less as a simple principle for organizing curricula, organizing library shelves. Acknowledge that the overlap among genres does something fresh to the ideas. Acknowledge that it is a tool for sense-making rather than a framework for immutable laws. And this is a very Wittgensteinian approach. Andrew DeVart wrote back in 2008, referencing film in particular, and I'll quote from him, "We can't really leave genre behind any more than we can abandon modernism or industry or structuralism. We've just mutated it to the point that it somehow feels new and different. Maybe we should start thinking post as less of a temporal marker and more like computational logic. Let's think of it as an upgrade, genre 2.0, based on the same fundamental hardware, but with such forward-thinking software that it hardly warrants comparison." And I like that, particularly the sense of forward-thinking, of a future-mindedness that might allow us to deal better with the wicked problems we're all drowning in. Such analyses, such a framework is where we both enter and lose the logic of genre. Yes, genre offers signposts, but it can't actually perform the sort of convincing, reassuring taxonomical structure that the sciences provide. Still, it matters. It lays out a sort of direction finding. It's a bit like learning's direction finding duck. It's moving all the time, but still points in a particular direction. It offers what Todorov calls a horizon of expectations. So you're not just seeing the thing itself, you're seeing all the possibilities it might be and the ones that it isn't as well. And what I think is most crucially useful in this post-genre era is the explicitly articulated awareness that genre contains within itself its own critique. It's like, some economists say that work contains the critique of work, labor contains the critique of labor. Genre does the same thing. It can gesture towards, but it can't confine our possibilities of meaning-making or our understanding of the world. And recognizing this, what can be a very generative instability, is a foundation for the kinds of writing, other artwork, and dare I say, institutional organization that might just possibly extend and expand our ways of thinking and being. And I'll leave it there, even though it's early, because I'd rather talk than announce.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So I'm going to call for comments and conversation. We've got plenty of time, so it'd be great to start getting into some of these thorny issues that Jen's raised. Any questions or comments? Diane.
Hi, Jen.
Hey, Diane.
I really enjoyed that. Lots to think about. But coming from my perspective as not as a creative writer, but having dealt with botanical classification, DNA has thrown it all up in the air. So I guess my question is, could AI turn genre discussions, debates, etc., upside down?
Could it? It can do anything it wants because it doesn't know what it's doing. It just blunders through the world like an elephant, a drunk elephant. African elephants knock down fruit in season, wait till they ferment, then they go back and drink it, get really drunk and trash the local villages. So I think AI is a bit like that, really. It could. Would it have any meaning? Would it be useful? DNA is very useful in the sciences, I agree, because it makes us think differently about what a tree is and what a bee is, for instance. But with genres, we made them up in the first place. They aren't real. They are ideas that we have, points of difference that we might recognize only because we are immersed in language. I mean, genre applies to art, to beautiful fabric art like you make as much as anything. So we feel that we can see similarities and differences. I mean, there are similarities and differences. Are they real? Do they matter? Probably not. And I don't think AI would address the real issues that, that are coming out of post-genre thinking, which is, for instance, the naked flaws of power and the naked rendering invisible of everything but a Western perspective and how things are organized. I don't think AI is coming out of a contemporary hegemonic way of thinking, so I don't think it would do anything to interrupt those, really. Don't know, though. I try not to know about AI. Yeah.
Hi, Jen. Great talk, obviously. I was interested in genre. Ishiguro talks about, he doesn't really believe in genre. He doesn't understand it, but maybe it's for others to decide. But what about in poetry and genre? How do you think about genre in poetry? And how does that, how can you integrate genre ideas into poetry? And is that a whole another field, genre poetry, or does it not exist? Or what do you think about all that? And as you're like the poet, and Julia is a novelist, and Kate, how do they all feel about these weird classifications? How do they overlap?
I think there's a lot of overlap. I should say that Irfan is just about ready to submit his PhD, which is fundamentally a genre-breaking and remaking work. So he's right into this. Gives me lots of thoughts. Yeah. Okay. The word genre is also like we have genre paintings. We kind of know what it means, even though it doesn't mean. There are genres of paintings and there are genre paintings. There are genres of poetry, and I suppose you could say there's genre poetry. There's so many ways of cutting it up, and people are passionate about them. I write prose poetry because I don't understand where to break a line. That's the only reason I write prose poetry. I just can't settle on where a line break should be. When I show my prose poems sometimes to friends, especially older men, dare I say, they immediately turn them into lineated poems and say, see, that's much better. I say, well, it's different anyway. Sonnets, you might call that a genre, the various forms that we use. Even limericks, if Tony were here, he'd, I'm sure, call about limericks. So there are lots of subgenres within poetry. And we can get into this kind of the endless recursion of dolls and say, there's literature, and there's published work, and there's poetry, and then within poetry there's this, and they're getting smaller and smaller. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to taste. Bush poetry is a genre. I've heard a lot of it recently because I've been at folk festivals. Fucking loathe it, But I would never say that to people doing bush poetry because it is an established form as far as they're concerned. They love it, they memorize it, good for them. I don't. But they probably don't like my vague, imagistic, sad, everybody died prose poems, Yeah. So no, I think there are genres, but do we use them? Do they structure how we work? To some extent, but only to some extent. As far as where Julia and Kate and I are working, really what's happening is that Julia is doing a lot of stuff on new realism, which is up your alley. I mean, I think you find that very interesting. Kate is looking at very much at the lyric and how other kinds of writing come into lyric essays, including autobiography, memoir, science. Okay, and what I'm doing, I'm being the good girl, and I'm knitting everything together with theories. So that's kind of how that one's working.
Hi, Jen. That was a great talk, and I particularly like the idea that you raised about we're sort of, as opposed to post-genre 2.0. And I actually think that's kind of blown my mind. One of the things I was thinking about is when I read about sort of post-genre discussions, I always think outside of what the creator intends or doesn't intend, there's a whole bunch of outside forces that shape the genre or will actually declare the genre. You'll have the genre's audience who will identify something and they locate, whatever their thing is, whether it's music or poetry or novel, it belongs to that genre. And then you'll have, I guess, the gatekeeping forces, whether it's publishers or people even marketing a book. What genre is it? Is it YA? Is it this? Is it literary? So there's all these outside forces who have their own reasons to locate genre. So I guess my question is, because there were I can't see a situation where there wouldn't be outside forces trying to locate a piece of work belonging to a genre. Would it ever be possible to have a real post-genre thing?
Probably as possible it is to have genuine postmodernism, as though modernism doesn't exist anymore. We keep building on each other. It's a lapidary effect, the layering of these fault lines, I suppose they are. I think an important point is that that texts don't belong to genres. They participate in aspects of them. And so it still works well. Like you said, it is the gatekeepers, and sometimes they get it right. And I have one of my favorite thinkings about genre happened about 20 years ago. Bill Manhire was the poet laureate of New Zealand. He also taught creative writing, and he had a very good book out called Mutes and Earthquakes, which was about teaching creative writing. And I wanted to get a copy of it for a friend teaching creative writing somewhere else. I was in New Zealand, went to the bookshop, wasn't there. They looked it up. I said, it's in geology. Yeah, it's not about geology. It's about creative writing. Didn't you look inside? Didn't you read the blurb? So the gatekeepers don't necessarily even know what they're doing any more than we do. I don't think when I start to write, this is going to be this kind of essay. It's going to be this kind of creative work. I just sit and write. And when it comes out, when it's done, then I think about where I will send it. And I'll send it to somebody who will see it as the kind of genre that they like. But it's not actually in the genre. I didn't write it for the genre. I just participated briefly in aspects of it. Yeah.
Jen, your talk made me reflect on a task that I've been cursed with for my sins, which is having to look up FOR codes, field of research codes, to categorise research. And we tend to think of those distinctions in terms of discipline, but I was just thinking we could just as well call them genres, which, to pursue the line of thinking that you've been authoring, it gets one thinking, well, there's no such thing as research per se. It's so many different genres of research which overlap and, don't overlap too in other ways. So I guess I'm just wondering, what you think about using genre for varieties of research or discipline.
What I think was very useful there is it's a way of reminding the bean counters that they're just using a comparatively empty set of categories where things might or might not fit. Now, I worked on ERA, Excellence in Research for Australia, which was the evaluation of all the quality of all the research done in Australia every few years. It was a hell of a job. But what happens is you have the field of research codes, and then you have to be tested against them. And all of us who were busy preparing universities' portfolios to be sent to the committees that would say, yes, you're good, bad, or indifferent, spent a lot of time shuffling things between field of research codes so you had a better look. And there were a number of documents that could easily have been in design or in digital media or in visual art or in that in our faculty, for instance. It's a fantasy that they fit there comfortably. The field of research codes themselves are fantasies, which is one of the reasons I think they are reviewed every 8 or 10 years. I mean, when creative writing didn't even exist early on, then it was done as creative professional writing and journalism, and then thought, oh, in communication, they thought, oh, maybe it's an art form, maybe we should put it with art. How does it fit with art? Even in art, I mean, you're limited in what you can say about the kinds of art. They do not allow you to you're either fine art or your craft, basically. There's also stuff in between, but those genres are utterly ignored. And the logic behind the fields of research and the analysis, the evaluation of research is that it fits snugly and neatly within that genre, that box. If it doesn't fit there, it's not very good work. So it's evaluative. I mean, I think it's important always to remember that generic organization is evaluative as well as performative. Yeah. Yeah. Are you enjoying them?
No comment. Yeah, Tracy.
Thank you, Jen. Lovely talk, and I really enjoyed it. And you started towards the end to talk about the work that genre does in bolstering forms of power in society. And yesterday on the radio, as I was driving home, I heard a commentator talking about how the Trump administration is using the genre of the Western to couch what they're doing in comprehensible terms. And it made me think about, so that it leads to expectations of outcomes. And it made me think about how in my work I have tended to try and, which is not about genre, but I try and think about what cultural formations do rather than what they mean, and the impact that they have, or the work that they do in society. And so I wonder if you could comment on these important genres that verge into archetypes and tropes that lead to important cultural formations and expectations of outcomes, and the way in which they're used and linked to power.
Well, let's go with the Western, because that is a compelling one. It's been around for quite a long time, except for the rare movies like Blazing Saddles that simply parodize it all, if I can use that word. They follow the rules fairly strictly. They don't do what Derrida says, which is to hedge through, break out, do other things, mix and match with others. There's this miscegenation you get there. And the Western genre it's a justification for centuries of abuse. It's almost always white people. It's almost always white men. It's almost always heroic. It's always about the rights that they have to be there. And then the competition with rights. So whose rights are there? So some Westerns are about, here's the great big landholder, and they're attacking my right to have my 6 sheep or to ride through there. So we've got to go to war. And Shane, fortunately, rides in and he sorts it out for them all, for instance. The lone white male hero who doesn't have family, he doesn't have a job, doesn't have responsibilities, but he's super cool and really important. And the others are, the settling the country, which means killing everybody who's there in the way, and pretending it's okay, acting as though it's okay. So it becomes this. We all know the Western genre really well, I think, and it's predicated on violence, exploitation, abuse, and a kind of manosphere vision of the world that is a very compelling one, because it does transmute into other kinds of generic conventions. And I'm not the least surprised that the Trump regime is using the Western, because they're all absolute dickheads, and they aren't prepared to think outside that. I mean, that ghastly woman, Christy Noem, running around with cosplaying cowboys, for instance. The sheriff who does everything right. All the markers of that particular genre are designed for abuse, I would say, and terrible exploitation. And it's so easy to mobilize them. And then once it's mobilized, if you don't think about what genres are doing and how the fact that they exceed themselves all the time indicates the abuse of power or bad mistakes somewhere along the line, you have the warm fuzzy go, oh, John Wayne, the Duke is here. And you think about that rather than looking at what's actually going on. So they direct attention away from one thing and toward another. And in that sense, they're a little bit like metaphors, but I think probably more destructive when we come into political discourse. I don't think it does any harm to call something a prose poem or a short story. I don't think there's, no one's harmed by that except the writer who thought that they were doing one and not the other. But when it starts being used in the economy, in the polity, in health, and all those other institutions, then you start seeing genuine human and environmental damage. And thank you, I hadn't heard that, but I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. I've not heard your power before, and it's wonderful to hear your strength and academic excellence come across to us. So thank you very much for that tour de force. I'm not really familiar with this field, and I'm really fascinated by it. But I'm also fascinated by the story that you told, a story of loss, a story of physical loss, a story of mental loss and mental capacity, and how the genres change in that time. And I'm also interested in the loss that we're experiencing now in terms of how we understand words. For example, large language models don't actually use words, they use tokens and bits of words. And so the question, probably slightly left field, is where does intactness of our society and where does intactness of ourselves as individuals and intactness of ourselves as academics, where does that play a role in how we set up our taxonomies or our genres?
That's a really good question, a really difficult one. What the guy who's coming on Monday, what's the last line? What kind of human? Irreducible human. The irreducible human. Yeah, the irreducible human is something I think we all fantasize that we are ourselves or hope that we are, and we're not. I mean, we're flickerings of light and sound in a vast universe. So those kind of genres of this is us, this is me, allow us a sense of stability, continuity, and a teleological structure to our lives. This happens because of this, and it's taking me to that good place or that bad place if I'm a bad person. And they govern how we think about ourselves and others and how we engage in our lives. I'm kind of making this up on the fly, but I'm thinking of, again, Wittgenstein in particular, Hegel to some extent. How do we know ourselves? Yeah? And we know ourselves and the world in a very large way through language. The symbolic structures of language and language making are how we build our worlds, at least imaginatively, intellectually, and then that becomes the actual world that we think we see, that we think we perceive. And I think I think genre has a significant role to play there, because that tells us what a world can be and what needs to be put into it to make it effective, to make it operate appropriately, whether it's right or wrong. And then we will justify that to ourselves, because if humans do one thing really well, it's justify. They're not good usually. I mean, they're bad justifications, but we make excuses for ourselves, and we figure that it must be right. It looked right in the models, and it has to work. Therefore, if it's not working, it's probably your fault. You probably put a bug in the machine. So I do think that coming back to language, AI, to go back to your idea, AI doesn't use words like we do. AI doesn't have emotional or phenomenological feelings. It can't. It can mimic them, but it can't actually have them. So I guess in that case, I'll reverse my idea and say maybe we'll change genres radically, because it doesn't understand what they're doing. It doesn't understand them as more than just a placeholder, that they are actually active operational things, machines that we also use for our sense of identity and our continuity, I think. But I need to think about that a whole lot more. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Jen, can I take you back to the anecdote in the dementia ward where the two individuals were playing a game and they didn't know the rules and they were instructed to pretend. That strikes me as something that would be a phenomenon of dementia, but also just of everyday interaction among fully remembering people as well, including probably the Trump administration trying to, make up on the spot how what they're doing is like a Western, and probably dealing with dementia as well, actually. But I just wanted to throw that back and see what you'd say. Like, is there a kind of a making it up all over the place with genre?
I think there is, and I totally agree with you. The just pretend. I mean, I've just spent a few days with my little grandchildren, and pretend is what we do all the time. They pretend they're doing this. I say pretend you're doing that. Let's do X, which isn't real. And I think maybe that's why it might have worked, and why the therapists who were there used that for the elderly folk, because pretend is something we're used to. It's one of our early memories. It stays with us. But I think most of what we do, I don't think most, I don't think. Most of what we do, I will say affirmatively, we make up on the fly. We make it up based on what we've already learned, our tacit understandings. If there's time and we have the energy, we then go to more an analytical approach and see what's going on. But most of the time, I think we blunder through life. Step into the road without looking. I'm using that metaphorically. And I do think that's a part of human creativity. Our attention is always going in a number of different ways. And so we have to pretend that I pretend that I'm giving a talk here, but actually I'm thinking about coffee. I'm thinking about that bit of Wittgenstein I love so much. I'm remembering that there's an exhibition being installed where I should have been, but I'm not at the moment. So my attention is being flared around, and I'm just pretending to be a presenter, but I am presenting as well. So in the pretense, there is always an actuality. Those two old people, I watched them for a while. They were playing, and they kind of putting down cards and taking cards, and it passed the time. They connect with one another to some extent, I think. And so pretense, I think, is a good thing. It's imagination.
Kerry.
Hi, Jen. I've missed
Thank you.
listening to you. 4.5 beautiful years of it. My question is kind of both from a viewer or a reader and a practitioner perspective. And if we think of genre as a signpost, I like this or I like that, or I'll go and see this or I'll read that because it's, whatever genre it might be in. But I wonder if it's also a form of tribalism as well. So in a disenfranchised world, or people being increasingly isolated, whether liking something of a particular genre or being a practitioner of a particular genre gives us that sense of belonging that may not necessarily be there with other things in our life.
That's a good question. I think it probably has validity. And not belonging. So in 1993, I was actually in Australia then. I was in Queensland, and they were having the first Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art. That's become, they're up to over a dozen now. And it was the first time in Australia that contemporary Asia Pacific art had been shown. So we were pretty familiar with the classical stuff. And I'm literate with respect to visual art. I was there with my sister, who is an artist and who taught art. We walked around together and going, I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know how it's interesting, but I've got no idea what it's saying. I don't know what it's attempting to deliver. We were excluded from that. And then over the next 2 or 3 triennales, a lot of us who do art in Australia started understanding it, started reading the genre and understanding it. But up to that point, that was not our tribe. My tribe was more the European and the American minimalists, modernists, whoever they might be. And I had to learn to read those like a small child, learning how to read all over again. In that reading, and then in my work for ABT, in my first PhD, I became something of an expert, a small expert in that area. And then I could go, yeah, I'm right in that tribe. That's me. But I'm not. I'm not Asian. I'm not from the Pacific, even though I've lived in the Pacific. So I can only ever be there as an overseer, in the worst possible sense, deciding what is and isn't written about, what is and isn't seen. So I think, it's again, it comes back to power. It's always framing, telling us what we like, and telling us who should like us, and who is like us. And those are always very, very malleable constructs, temporary constructs. And yes, and what happens? I think, Paul, whether you think about how genre might work in traditional Indigenous communities, for instance, which I think is probably different from the Western ones.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I've just got a new doctor in the house. I probably could speak a lot better on this than I, having looked at Pitjara hand talk. So I was thinking about the categories within, or the genres within genres. So Rick says those that are outside it as well. And who gets to decide these things? I mean, it's in some ways, it has to be a given. The genre has to be a given thing. So if I think of hand talk, I can't get my fingers into the position your nimble hands can, but you're a pianist, aren't you?
No.
Oh, there you go, son. You're outside the
No.
play the bass.
That's even more difficult. Press. Yeah.
That wrecked the band.
Mm.
Just say something like that is emu or something like that, okay? But then you've got sand talk, hand talk and sand talk.
Mm.
They're both a form of communication. They're both a language, but they're very different in what purpose they serve and who they speak to. Would you agree?
Yes, they're different modalities of communication. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm.
Very.
Yeah.
And malleable.
It's true.
Well, then they disappear.
Ephemeral.
Ephemeral. Yeah. Spiral. Yeah. So I don't really have a question, but again, the original of hand talk would have been, well, for what you did in your PhD, it was with women who were in grief, grieving, mourning.
Mm.
So they couldn't speak or be seen to be speaking verbally. Therefore, it could be enjoying themselves or seen to be enjoying themselves. But the pose would be in hand signs. Now, with sand talk, it's a different story. It's generally about cosmology or something around law. And then when it's over, just rub it out. Rub it out. So the rubbing it out wasn't so that it wasn't there to be seen again, because they could always redo it. But the lesson was over. But had there been a given to agree to use that form and to use it in that way to start off with. I don't know about Pitjantjatjara women, whether they were given the choice in the original state of mourning, or it was an expectation, like the roles within the hospital of the nurses and the patients.
A genre of mourning.
Genre mourning.
That performs in these particular ways. Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to, for instance, the Victorian genre of mourning, which preserves the hair into perpetuity and bits of jet into perpetuity rather than the erasing, but I can write it again.
Because I'm involved in grief and bereavement,
Yeah.
the hair was actually a protective thing as well. They used to hang it on doorknobs to keep evil spirits away. So
I wouldn't touch a doorknob that had someone's hair in it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's
Yeah.
it's been different things in different cultures at different times. So
Yeah.
yeah. How
It's very very pervasive. Yeah. 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 And we think of the artworks of, I'm thinking now of Southern Africa and the ways in which art, the decoration of houses, for instance, in the belly, art is really, really different from the Tswana, the Sotho, Xhosa. And you can see the stories are told, they're not told in relation to the house decoration, but they're told as part of that particular worldview. And the stories are similar, like all traditional stories have a similarity, but they're also quite distinct differences in understandings of how the world operates. You know, the strong colors and the geometrical shapes of Ndebele are about, it's a branch of the Zulu community, Zulu people. So it's about toughness and capability and being in charge. And the gentler, more sort of woven art approaches are more about connection to the land and being part of the environment. Not that they're radically different, but they're sufficiently different that you can see there's a generic structuring of my world that manifests in different kinds of practices, I think. Not an anthropologist.
Come.
Hi, Jen. Thank you
Hi,
for the
Carmen.
wonderful talk. Very interesting. I've just been musing in my own little brain about the evolution of the recognition of genre. Early writing was very different from forms of speech because it took the form of poetry right from the earliest times, and then prose accounts developed. So in a way, genre, to my mind, developed as a convenience, as a way of accepting or recognising different forms, but has now assumed a power position because it's moved from into an acceptance and expectation, particularly when you look at industry, the current industry, they're sort of the gatekeepers that you spoke about earlier. That I'm not quite sure what my question is, but do you see that the evolution as an inevitable part of our society and development of civilization? So the need to classify, taxonomy.
The need to classify, yes. Is it evolution or is it just shifting, expanding, deepening as we become more complex societies?
The need to classify has now become the law of classification. So it's more.
It has. I think if you think about some very early, like hunter-gatherer communities, there are genres of a sort, but they're not very many because you don't own a lot of possessions and you don't do a lot of mechanical stuff. You do a lot of thinking, a lot of seeing, a lot of storytelling. So you don't need to classify as much because it's a very complex, but a smaller and more coherent community. I think that's where that is. By the time you get to Aristotle, the whole world of the Greek part of the world and invading everybody else was becoming extremely complex. And so there you can see why he might start saying, well, we need this sort of story. We need a tragedy because it allows us to think this way. We need poetry because it allows imagination. We need philosophical writings because we need to learn. And so there is a practical and evidentiary need for it, I suppose. And then we start carving into them subgenres, subs of subgenres, because we are organizing and I guess packaging and selling as much as anything. Selling university courses, selling books and artworks, selling clothes. Yeah. So I don't know. I hadn't thought about it in terms of evolution. I don't think it's probably the term I'd use because I think about that as more increased fitness for purpose. I'm not sure genres are fit for purpose. Not really. I think they're just guardrails or scaffolding that we can use, I think.
Great. We'll bring things to a close at that point. Please join me in thanking Jen.
Thank you.